Today, Artemis and I wanted to make a video and talk a little more in depth about why I left the church. So I grew up in a Pentecostal church in Duncanville, Texas. It was a church my whole family went to, my grandparents attended, my father attended it his whole life, and I attended the church since I was a wee little lamb all the way into my adulthood. When I was a teenager, I started working in the church. I started in our children's ministry, helped out there, did a little bit of music. I would do puppets and put on skits for the kids. I would do things like go to summer camps and be a camp counselor. And then I started working in our youth group while I attended as a teenager. And then I started leading worship. And I got hired in the church to be the assistant to the worship leader. As a kid, I was a leader of a Bible study in junior high and in high school. The church and church programs and the Bible really was my whole entire life. So why would I leave it? Is a good question. And it's not so simply answered. It took many years and certainly wasn't one thing. I think that I grew up in a very good church and that the people teaching there were very genuine and they really believed what they were saying was the best thing for me. Now, I probably have disagreements about that on this side of it all. Really on this side of adulthood, I disagree deeply with many of the things that I was taught there, but I have very little doubt that they were sincere and thought they were doing what was best. For me, a big deciding moment in me leaving the church, I was there working in the church one day, and I was listening to a podcast called Bad Christian Podcast. It's put on by two members of a band called Emery. If you were into emo Christian rock as a youth, you might know them. And they had on a guest named Edward Fudge, who, apart from his amazing name, had some very interesting ideas. He proposed a view of hell called the conditionalist view of hell. And the conditionalist view of hell states that a person's eternal soul is conditionally eternal. So that means that not everyone is going to live forever. What he says is that if you were to die and you're supposed to go to heaven because you accepted Christ into your life, then your soul is eternal and you live forever. But he makes the argument that hell is not a place for humans, but is a place for the devil and demons, and that no person is going to hell. And those who in the traditional view should be going to hell simply cease to exist. And Mr. Fudge says, like, scriptures that say, "For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life." He says they are literal, in that it really means death and that you would cease to exist. He says this lines up with the justice of God, in that for a lifetime of sin you wouldn't receive an eternity of punishment. It calls back to some early Jewish beliefs about the afterlife and eternity. From my understanding, the early church didn't believe in a hell for people, and their views on the afterlife were quite a bit different than modern Protestant views of the afterlife. And when I heard this view of the conditionalist view of hell, it was compelling to me. Certainly enough to relax some of my fears about dying and going to hell forever. Fears I had been developing since I was a wee little babe in church. And when my fear kind of relaxed of hell, I began to engage with my natural curiosity about world religions. And I had always been curious to learn more about what people around the world were believing, to make sense of life, to make sense of death. And I had restrained myself from much investigation because I was taught that exposure to contrary ideas was dangerous, and that the devil would use those ideas to sow deceit and deception in my life. That he would confuse me and convince me to abandon my Christian ideals. Now my friends and family that still belong to that tradition probably believe that about me now, that I have been confused and deceived by a spirit of rebellion, that I am lost, perhaps backslidden is a fun Christian phrase about someone who used to believe and no longer does. So I lost a good deal of my fear, and so I felt freedom, I suppose, to explore the belief systems. At that time, I was working as an assistant to the worship leader. I was running the worship program in our youth group, and I remember there was a kind of a 2-week stretch where I was singing the songs, and it's, our God is greater than all other gods. There's no one before you. I love you with all my heart. And I realized I did not believe what I was singing. And I was at the front of the stage leading all of these children in a song full of theology that I couldn't accept. I had this feeling of disgust with myself that I was perpetuating a belief system I no longer believed in. And it was a very stark change. I'd never felt that before. And I led worship one more week after that, and then after that I was done. The timing was kind of good for me. I had been offered a job at another church in a small town to be a worship leader, to be a head worship leader, to have my own little thing. And so I told the church I was working for that I wanted to explore worship from other denominations. I grew up in a Pentecostal church, and so the worship is rather charismatic. It's like going to a rock concert, big stage, talented musicians, lots of production. And so I said I wanted to go see how other denominations did worship so that I could learn in preparation for this position that I had been offered. And I did. I went to a bunch of different churches. I tried out a Catholic church. I tried out a Baptist church, a Methodist church. I went to a Presbyterian church. I attended a Unitarian Universalist church, which turned out to be amazing. And I ended up attending many years later in Dallas, and I observed these worship services. And at the time, I was going to Bible school and studying English in a Bible school. But in my particular private Christian school, you were required to attend chapel services 5 days a week. So I worked in a church on Sunday morning. I worked in that church on Wednesday night. I had band practice for church on Thursday nights. And I had to attend 5 chapel services at my private Christian school. So I went to 7 services a week for a semester or two. And I left my home church at this point and started touring other churches, and I found myself in the audience listening to these pastors. And in my own mind, the whole time, I was counteracting what they were saying. I was angry. I was skeptical. I was suspicious of their words now. Something in me had shifted, and I no longer trusted the people on stage to bring me the truth. And I just remember feeling so mad all the time in those services. And it came to a point where I realized that it wasn't doing me or anyone else any good for me to be there. I was more than unhappy. I was fed up. And so I stopped. I stopped going to church altogether for the first time in my life. I still went to the mandatory services at my school. I got a waiver, so I didn't have to go to as many of them for work, and that was really nice. I stopped living on campus and moved back home for a year to finish my degree. And then as soon as I was done, a month after I graduated from my private Christian university, I moved to Dallas, Texas, into the city, where I was working in a restaurant and bartending on the low, and I was making enough money to support myself. And so I moved out, and then I spent probably 2 years in a kind of fugue state. My whole worldview was constructed under the tutelage of the Christian church. I did not know how to engage with life apart from the biblical perspective. Every decision I made, I passed through a filter of, does God want me to do this? Does this further the kingdom of Christ? God, should I do this? Make it clear to me what I should do. I was oftentimes paralyzed by indecision because I was unsure the path which God wanted me to take. But it was how I oriented myself in the world and how I made every decision. And I no longer had that. And I left my main source of community, which was the church. I mean, most of my formative relationships as a child happened in the church. My best friend growing up went to the same church as me. All of my mentors were from the church. Most of the people I knew in my whole life were involved in the church in some way. It was my whole entire world. And leaving that was devastating to me, emotionally and socially and spiritually. And I was left confused and angry and so burnt out. And I felt as though I had sacrificed so much of my time and so many of the things I naturally wanted to do because I believed they weren't furthering the cause of Christ, or that I should spend my time in service to God in some way. And so I felt so very, very dejected and angry at the loss of time I felt I had wasted in some ways. When you work in a church, you end up volunteering much of your time. Like, so much of your time goes unpaid when working for a church. And I remember this sense of disillusionment washing over me that made me cynical about the whole world. And I stayed in that place of anger and confusion for a couple years. And I got sick of myself. I think is part of it. A friend of mine, an artist that I respected, that always brought me interesting perspectives in my life, had recommended to me a book of Taoist devotions. The Tao Te Ching is the central text of Taoism. It's not really a religion. It's a book of poetry, essentially, that very lightly gives advice on the way of things, of how the world works, and what it means to live a balanced life. And so I started meditating lightly in the mornings. I would sit in my little 500 square foot first apartment with the sunbeams coming through the window. I would sit on my little carpet and open this Taoist devotional book, and I would read a page a day and just kind of sit there with it. And it reawakened some of that religious instinct and desire for spiritual connection in my heart. I found out that hadn't died, that I wasn't quite an atheist, but I had no real conception of who God was. I stopped believing that he was a father and a king, and that he had prescribed in this book a very specific way for me to live out my days. And I began to formulate a conception of God as this idea of unity or oneness, like a river, and you and I are all drops that fall from this river in space, and we have this experience as a human. In any case, the Tao Te Ching helped me to engage with spirituality in a way that did not make me feel disgusted with myself or God, I suppose. I could no longer stomach the idea of a just Christian God who would send people to an eternity of hell for a lifetime of sin. And I figured and reasoned in my heart and mind that if that was the way God did things, and he did exist, I wanted nothing to do with him. And my conception of God has changed now quite a bit. But I am very grateful that I found something that brought me back into the world of spiritual experience. Because I'm not quite sure what the purpose of life is or what happens to us after we die. But I do think we, by and large, all experience a religious instinct to connect with mystery and chaos and the things we can't explain in the world around us. We need some kind of tool set to engage with. And for me, that has been the Tao. It has brought me great peace and balance in my life. So if you made it this far, thank you so much for listening to my story. You can find a literary version of my story of leaving the church at ReverendGrey.com, Grey, Grey, where I've posted my story and written about it and linked there. I look forward to making more of these videos and engaging with people who've had a similar experience of losing faith and still seeking out some kind of spiritual practice. I know there's many of you out there because I have talked to many of you in person who have shared some of the same doubts and curiosities and perspectives about their old faith and a desire to come and engage with something new and fresh in their life. And if that's you, I'd love to talk to you. I have no prescription for you, but I can certainly listen and share some of my experience. Until we talk again, my friends, stay gray.